Can we start with a very basic question? Can you give us an idea about your understanding of exactly what advocacy is?
Well, that's a pretty good question, because advocacy as a word gets bandied around by a lot of people. They say, I advocate for this or that. And so it's a commonly used word, and in some ways is losing its meaning a little bit, as we might use it specific to the issues surrounding advocating for another person and on behalf of. So it's usually associated with some action, speaking, acting, writing, a kind of doing something for the sincerely understood benefit of someone else. And therefore doing something that positions the person to be more favourable in the eyes of a third party. And so it's usually involving then the advocate, the person or party that they're interested in, or the issue that they're interested in, and then representing that interest powerfully, vigorously to another party that has hoped that that advocacy will influence towards a certain direction.
So how does advocacy respond to the different needs that people with disability might have?
I think a lot of advocacy is done in a really natural way. Parents who advocate for their kids with a school teacher or principal. Our advocacy towards a doctor to get a second opinion. Those kind of things we might say are quite informal and kind of everyday and natural. But some people are in circumstances where they need a little bit more help, and we now have a kind of process we use called self-advocacy, where we assist people to speak up on their own behalf. We might rehearse with them the kind of issues, attending a meeting, going for a job, making a complaint and seeing it through and knowing how to voice that themselves. And so that's a very good scheme that helps people, as it were, advocate for themselves, to learn to speak up and be understood and appreciated in that regard. And there are lots of movements that do that. For other people, there's an advocacy form where the advocacy is on their behalf. You might say that their ability to see and understand the issues that they face and to speak up on their behalf is weakened in some way. And in that respect then that we speak up on their behalf quite vigorously, but in a sense representing their own voice, representing their needs, that idea of sincerely understanding the needs of another party, another person, and representing that interest to someone else who doesn't get that. And so this is an interesting form of advocacy because it tries to resolve problems that the person themselves may be unable to resolve themselves. And that's a long-term issue. And they often represent people who are also devalued. That is, their status in the eyes of other people is seen as very low indeed. So who takes notice of that person? And so this advocacy is on that behalf, that is not just an episodic kind of devaluation, but people who are very likely to be devalued for all or much of their life stand to be very vulnerable to being controlled and moved about, and their relationships controlled, their finances controlled. And here therefore need a kind of vigorous advocacy that can speak up on their behalf and be able to represent that. And so some of these then are formal kind of ideas. Sometimes they're appeals to the system, and sometimes they're forms of advocacy that are kind of to the situation that they're in, the service, the doctor, the transport service, some representation of that person's interest. Of course, a very effective form of advocacy is to know how vulnerable a person is in advance, and therefore to do some things in advance of a situation arising and to prevent things happening before they happen. So rather than be only concerned with crisis or complaint, they get to respond in advance to a situation that's likely to arise if no action occurred at all. So this is kind of preempting a situation and acting in advance, understanding this person is vulnerable to these kind of bad things happening, and there's a high probability that these will happen. Therefore, I can do some things right now to ensure that that doesn't take place. And that's a very exciting and a kind of form of advocacy that has great insight because it brings a thorough knowledge of the person that they're there to represent.